Hi everybody. Over the course of the past few months, I have done analyses on all of the popular decks in Pioneer. And so I wanted to sort of put all of those analysis and deck techs into one video. So you have one video to watch and you can kind of understand every deck in Pioneer in one spot, which is important if you want to be able to be good at Pioneer, because knowing other deck strategies is kind of a part of beating those decks. So I hope you enjoy it. This is my red-black mid-range deck. Let's go through it all. I'm going to reorganize really quickly to make it easier to talk about. Normal magic things. All right, so I divided them into, I would say, like the categories of the deck. But let's talk about the lands first. We really want our lands to come in untapped, so we're playing for Blackcleave Cliffs. Really the only card that we can't play on curve alongside Blackcleave Cliffs is bringing back Kroxa and Archfiend, which is totally fine. That'll come up in so few games. Playing for Blightstep Pathway, red or black. Again, and our untap is excellent. Same thing with Blood Crypt. We're playing one Haunted Ridge, mostly because it's really important the first few turns of the game things come in untapped. So I'm down on Haunted Ridge at the moment. That might change in the future, but with all these aggro decks running around, we can't have things entering untapped early on. We're playing 2 Hive of the Eye Tyrant. I think it's just better than Den of the Bugbear. 1, because it's black and we are primarily a black deck. And 2 is being able to exile things in the graveyards, and having Menace is really good at finishing off. I'm also a big fan of Mutavaults. We're playing 3 Mutavaults just as additional cards that, you know, we can attack with. Playing 3 Sulphurous Springs just as something that unconditionally comes in untapped. 2 Swamps, a Takenuma because it's pretty free, and a single Urborg. This is a mid-range deck, so I divided the deck up into 4 categories: removal spells, hand destruction, card advantage / selection, and then our creatures. And some of these exist in multiple categories, but I put them in their sort of primary spot. So in our removal spell suite, we're playing 4 Fatal Push, just the best removal spell in Pioneer. 1 Torch the Tower, mostly for Phoenix, but also it's decent against aggro decks, you know, just a 1-mana removal spell. And then I split our 2-mana removal spells because each of them have some sort of condition that I'm a little afraid of. Shoot the Sheriff, non-outlaw creature. Powered Kill, non-angel, demon, devil, or dragon creature. This might need to be replaced because of how popular Archfiend of the Dross is and how popular the Angels deck is getting. Go for the Throat. And then we're playing 2 Bonecrusher Giant. Bonecrusher Giant also exists in the creature side of it as well. But the Stomp side, being able to remove something or just go face or hit a Planeswalker or something like that, then play a 4/3 is very, very good. That's all pretty face value stuff. As far as hand destruction, we're playing Thoughtseize, just the best hand destruction thing ever printed. You reveal their hand, get non-land from it, and they discard, but you lose 2 life. We're playing 1 Duress because hand destruction is getting better and better. Playing main deck hand destruction is excellent. And then we're playing a single Kroxa. We don't get to select what comes out of their hand, but it can come back, and it creates some level of inevitability in the deck, and I think that's really important against these slower decks. The glue that holds the deck together is Fable, which is in our card selection, card advantage kind of thing. It's a threat. It mana ramps if you can attack with that threat by creating a treasure with that 2/2 goblin it makes. You can discard 2 cards and draw that many cards with a second chapter, and then its third chapter, it flips into a reflection, which is frankly a must answer. So it can just kind of drain resources from the opponent while letting you select what cards that you have, and it's just all around excellent. We're playing 1 of Reckoner Bankbuster. I'm a little bit down on Reckoner Bankbuster compared to the other versions of the deck because there are less slower decks to play against, and drawing Reckoner Bankbuster against these like hyper aggressive decks that are floating around is just not good at all. We're playing 3 Graveyard Trespasser. It's just a difficult to answer threat as far as like removal spells go, and also it's graveyard hate, and also it gains life. Like, it's an all around pretty decent card. I think it's kind of bad at all of those things, but it providing all of those things on one card, I think, is worth it. We're playing 3 Inti. I'm such a big fan of Inti. I like Inti a lot. It provides sort of card advantage, so it probably exists in this category a little bit as well. But when I attack, I can discard a card, put a +1/+1 counter on the attacking creature, and it gains trample. And when you discard one or more cards, I can exile the top card of my library and then play it till my end step. So it creates some level of card selection, makes my creatures more aggressive. It also is really good alongside the blood tokens of Blood Tithe Harvester and alongside Fable the Mirror Breaker, as it allows me to do that exile clause. And it's just like a 2-drop. Just having more 2-drops is really good. We're playing 4 Blood Tithe Harvester. Is a 2-mana 3/2. Creates a blood token, and then, it's a removal spell on a stick, where a creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is twice the number of blood tokens you control. If I sacrifice Blood Tithe Harvester, being a removal spell is really good for this side of the deck, but also it's just like an aggressively costed creature, and very often I'm just attacking with Blood Tithe Harvester. And then we're playing 4 Archfiend of the Dross. Out goes Shieldred in Archfiend. Archfiend is so good because 1, it's so aggressive. 2, it's really good against other really powerful creatures. It blocks flyers. Archfiend is everything that this deck wants to be. People aren't really drawing cards anymore, except specifically Phoenix. And Archfiend is even great against Phoenix because it dodges Lightning Axe. And so we're on 4 Archfiend of the Dross, very good alongside Inti, very good alongside Reflection of Kiki Jiki. It's just all around excellent. Now, as far as our sideboard goes, Duress 2 through 4 is for decks that we need more hand destruction against non-creature spells against. Same thing with Go Blank. It's just a hand destruction card, but also very good against decks that have graveyards that we're worried about. Playing Extinction Event, which is mostly for mono green, but is just a very good board wipe against most decks. Playing Meat Hut Massacre. There's so many aggressive decks now that we are playing Meat Hut Massacre to be able to just wipe their board and gain a bunch of life in the process, and not being worried about being a certain mana cost like with Extinction Event or Hitotsugu Consumes All. Speaking of Hitotsugu Consumes All, we're playing that mostly for red-black sack because they make a lot of tokens and the oven and whatnot. But also it's very good against the really aggressive deck, specifically red-black aggro, because they're mostly 1-drops. We have to be a little bit more picky with Hitotsugu than we are with Meat Hut Massacre as well. Torch Tower just has another removal spell, also really good against Phoenix. Reckoner Bankbusters for these slower decks so we can draw more cards, and Unlicensed Hearse is our Graveyard Hate. So what this deck essentially is it is a Hate Bears deck, but not just a Hate Bears deck, but a Hate Bears deck that can sort of flood the field with these cards that are really annoying to play against. And all of the cards in the deck are very powerful and very annoying to play against. In addition to that, all of these 2 and 3 drop, I would call Hate Bears. You're playing the 8 elves, Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves, to ramp into these Hate Bears, and playing Collected Company so you can hit 2 at the same time. Look at the top 6 cards of your library, put 2 creature cards, mana value 3 or less from among them onto the battlefield, and the rest of the bottom of your library in any order. So you're going to be ramping into them with Elvish Mystic, so you like double spell, and then eventually hit like Collected Company to put a bunch of them on the battlefield. So let's go over the Hate Bears. First off, we're playing 2 Kellen. Kellen's just another decent 1-drop where we create a map token, sometimes multiple map tokens. And on the other side, if we hit it with a Collected Company or just cast Kellen, whenever it attacks, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card mana value 3 or less, put it in your hand. Otherwise, you may put it in your graveyard. So like 35 cards in our deck. Kellen hits, which is awesome. We can't play too many because they're legendary, but is a great card advantage engine. We're playing 3 Thalia. Thalia really doesn't neuter ourselves at all besides Collecting Company, but we should have the mana, especially with our elves. And is very good against decks that cast a lot of non-creature spells. So it's a 2-mana 2/1 first strike. Non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. And we're playing a 1 of Voice of Resurgence. Very good against these decks that are trying to play at instant speed. Is a 2-mana 2/2. Whenever an opponent casts a spell during your turn and when Voice of Resurgence dies, create a green-white elemental creature token with this creature's power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures you control. So very good against decks that are attempting to kill your creatures, very good against decks that are attempting to play at instant speed like Blue-White Control. However, not super powerful against other decks, so we were just playing it as a 1 of. We're playing 3 Anointed Peacekeepers in the main deck. Anointed Peacekeeper is a 3-mana 3/3 with Vigilance. When it enters, look at an opponent's hand, so it gives you information, so that's awesome. And then you choose any card name. So you get to see your opponent's hand. This is all a part of the same trigger. So your opponent won't be able to respond to you naming a card or looking at your hand or whatever. They have to do it before all of it happens. And spells your opponent casts with the chosen name cost 2 more. And activated abilities sorcered with the chosen name cost 2 more to activate unless they're mana abilities. So this is just kind of like a worse but also better Pithing Needle. You get information, so you make sure that the card that you name is always relevant. And very good against decks that rely on certain cards. And frankly, very good against decks that are looking to kill your creatures. Like naming Fatal Push with this is just insane. Or really any card in your opponent's hand. Archon of Emeria, another just hate card, is a 3-mana 2/3 flying. Each player can't cast more than one spell each turn, and non-basic lands your opponent control and are tapped. Both very, 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 very annoying. Mostly very good against Phoenix and combo decks because of that first line of text. And then the second line of text is good against like 90% of decks in Pioneer. Though remember, the first line of text affects you too, which is okay because a lot of things have flash or instant speed, like even Interrupter. It's a 3-mana 2/2 with flash and flying. When enters exile target spell, it becomes plotted, and spells your opponent casts from graveyards or exile cost 2 more to cast. So Aven Interrupter is kind of interesting because when something becomes plotted, it's exiled, which means it costs 2 more to cast. Yes, it's free, but it costs 2 more to cast. So Aven Interrupter is a really good, like, making your opponent sort of have a hitch in the get along, as we like to say in Maine. You can also hit it off of Collected Company to be able to, respond to something on the stack or whatever. Also, it exiles the spell on the stack. It doesn't counter, so it gets around uncounterable stuff like Supreme Verdict, for example. And then if you like Aven Interrupt or something and then Anointed Peacekeeper it costs 4 to cast from exile, which can be kind of tough. And multiple Aven Interrupters sort of stack with themselves. They all make things in exile cost 2 more to cast. Enduring Innocence is sort of the bread and butter of the deck. It is a 3-mana 2/1 with lifelink. Whenever one or more creatures you control power 2 or less enter, draw a card. This ability triggers only once each turn. And like every enduring enchantment creature, when it dies, return to the battlefield under its owner's control, except it's an enchantment and not a creature. This is very good because it triggers off of every single card in our deck besides Anointed Peacekeeper. And so it just becomes an insane card advantage engine that is not legendary. So you can have multiple. They're really, really hard to deal with because they keep coming back. And this is what makes the deck really overwhelming. You're hating out your opponent. You're drawing a ton of cards. You're getting a ridiculous amount of value off of Enduring Innocence. Playing for Skyclave Apparition is a 3-mana 2/2. When it enters, exile up to 1 target non-token permanent you don't control the mana value 4 or less. And when it leaves the battlefield, the exile card's owner creates an XX Blue Illusion creature token where X is the mana value of the exiled card. Just a very good removal spell, which we need that. It doesn't care if it's a creature or not, which is also awesome. Also, something very relevant, which I'll probably mention in my nuances video for this deck, the getting the spirit and exiling something are 2 different lines of text. So if this thing dies in response to the first line, they don't get a spirit, or they get a 0/0 because nothing is exiled with Skyclave Apparition when it dies. Playing 2 Werefox Bodyguard, another thing with flash, so we can play instant speed, again, playing around Archon really well, is a 3-mana 2/2 with flash. When it enters, exile up to 1 other target non-fox creature token until Werefox Bodyguard leaves the battlefield, and you can sacrifice it to gain 2 life, like a food. So just another removal spell, just so we can keep jamming in and attacking and end the game as fast as possible. And then we've already talked about Collected Company being able to hit 2 of any of these creatures at any point, which is just so good. You might have noticed in the main deck that there's a lot of double white, which is kind of a nombo with our mana dorks, but that's okay because every single one of our lands can produce white. The only time it kind of, is not good is when we have a multiple branch left pathway hand and we have to play it on the green side to play our Llanowar Elves, and then we can't really cast these double white things. But pretty much everything else, as long as we can cast Llanowar Elves on 1, we will have the double white on turn 2. So that's something that comes up once in a great while, but is not super relevant. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing 2 Portable Hull. Portable, very good against decks with mana dorks like the Mirror Match. Also very good against, aggressive decks, or if there's literally any permanent that costs 2 or less that, the deck revolves around, Artist Talent, whatever. 2 Unlicensed Hurts for our Graveyard Hate. Dermoka's Command is a very diverse card, mostly just a really good instant speed removal spell. Really good against cards like Anger of the Gods or Brotherhood's End, which is pretty good against us because we can prevent the damage instant sorcery would deal. Deals with enchantment. It's just super diverse with things that it does. Voice of Resurgence we've already talked about. Anointed Peacekeeper we've already talked about. We're playing 3 Brutal Cathar, sort of as Werefox Bodyguard, 5 through 7. Being able to exile creatures is just very powerful. There's just a little bit worse because it doesn't have flash and doesn't play well with Archon. We're playing Elite Spellbinder, which is a 3-mana 3/1 with flying. When it enters, look at the target opponent's hand, may exile a non-land card from it for as long as the card remains in exile. Its owner may play it. A spell played this way costs 2 more to cast, which, by the way, since it's exiled, combos with Aven Interrupter. So like if you exile something with Elite Spellbinder, Aven Interrupter, something else, that original thing exiled with Elite Spellbinder costs 4 more to cast, which is just disgusting. Can combo with multiple Aven Interrupters or even Anointed Peacekeeper. Just very good. Great hand hate against decks with cards that can kind of destroy us, like Supreme Verdict and whatnot. Werefox Bodyguard, we've already talked about. This is Werefox Bodyguard 3 and 4, so against creatures. And then Wandering Emperor, as a planeswalker, really good against aggressive decks, being able to exile and gain 2 life, but also solid against decks that have difficulty dealing with planeswalkers. This is Niv-to-Light in Pioneer. Now notice it's a Yorion deck. I think that's the first thing to point out. So it's running 80 cards in the main deck, and that's totally okay. Mostly because we have quite a few cards that can capitalize on Yorion, you know, being blinked, but also we want a lot of options to be able to grab with Bring to Light, which is the first card I wanted to point out. So this is effectively a mid-range, I play better cards than you deck that is trying to capitalize on Bring to Light. So Bring to Light is a 5 mana with Converge, basically meaning that if it does something better, the more colors you use to cast it. So search your library for a creature, instant, or sorcery card with mana value less than or equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast the spell. Exile that card, then shuffle. You may cast a card without paying this mana cost. So we're a 5-color deck. So the idea is we normally Bring to Light for 5. We can do it for 4. Oh, hi, kitty. And then we can toolbox pretty much our entire deck, barring the enchantments, which is why we're running so many 1-ofs. Now, on top of that, we also have a few value grabs. The primary value grab of this, which affects our deck building, is Niv-Mizzet Reborn. So we can either just cast Niv-Mizzet Reborn or Bring to Light for it. And it's a 6/6 with flying. When Niv-Mizzet Reborn enters, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each color pair, choose a card that's exactly those colors from among them. Put the chosen card into your hand and the rest of the bottom of your library in a random order. So the reason this influences deck building is because we want to play a bunch of different color pairs, basically just like every guild. So we need black-blue cards, black-white cards, black-green cards, green-white cards, red-white cards, all of that stuff, so we can grab them with Niv-Mizzet. And so we're running a bunch of 1-ofs in a ton of different color pairs, as you can see right here, to not only be a toolbox for Bring to Light, but also like as a Niv-Mizzet target. We also have a bunch of other Niv-Mizzet targets right here, but they're not 1-ofs, so we don't necessarily need a toolbox for them, but I think we should talk about them right now anyway. So as far as the non-1-of color pairs, we're playing Lightning Helix, deal 3 damage, gain 3 life, just very good. Again, also grabbable with Niv-Mizzet because it's a Boros color pair. Pillage the Bog, look at the top X cards of your library, where X is twice the number of lands you control, which we end up with a lot of lands in this deck if things go okay. Put one in your hand, the rest of the bottom of your library in random order. Very often this like ends up being a tutor. You can also plot it if you don't need a card right now, but want one later on. And you can search more lands. Abrupt Decay, spell can't be countered. Destroy target non-land permanent, mana value 3 or less. Just a very good Golgari target. And Vanishing Verse, which has gained a lot of stock recently. It is an Orzhov target, exile target monocolored permanent. So these cards are already like pretty good, but we aren't playing them as a 1-of, so we don't necessarily need a toolbox for them. Sometimes we'll grab them and Bring to Light, but it's pretty rare. As far as the toolbox cards, that are also a bunch of different guilds that we can grab with Niv-Mizzet Reborn. We're playing Hostage Taker, 4 mana 2/3. When Hostage Taker enters, exile another target creature or artifact until Hostage Taker leaves the battlefield. You may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled and spend mana of any type. It can be spent to cast that spell. Sorry, my brain farted for a second. So it's really good if your opponent has powerful creatures that you want to steal and answer. Alenda, Saint of Dust, which are also playing one in the sideboard, fun fact, is a 4 mana 4/4 with Hexproof and Lifelink from, with Hexproof from instance and Lifelink. So I thought a cat was throwing up or something, distracted me. As long as your life total is greater than your starting life total, Alenda gets +1/+1 and has menace. Alenda gets an additional +5/+5 as long as your life total is 10 greater than your starting life total. And this is kind of easy to do alongside Night of Autumn or Omnath, gaining life. It's just very good against, both aggressive decks, especially since it's hard to answer with the Hexproof from instance. Night of Autumn is just a really good toolbox card. Put 2 +1/+ encounters on it if you just want a big person. Destroy artifact or enchantment or gain 4 life. Deafening Clarion, great board wipe, especially against aggressive decks, because you can have your creatures gain lifelink and also gain a bunch of life alongside it, 3 damage to each creatures. Maelstrom Pulse, a Golgari target non-land permanent, and all other permanents of the same name. It destroys them. Kulagon's Command is another great toolbox card, and it's a Rakdos target. You can choose 2, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Target player discards a card, destroy target enchantment, or deals 2 damage to any target. Again, really, really good toolbox card. Main deck Artifact Hate can bring creatures back if it's a big grindy matchup. Unmoored Ego is an extraction effect, is a Dimir target. Choose a card name, search target opponent's graveyard, hand, and library for up to 4 cards with that name and exile them. That player shuffles, then draws a card for each card exiled from your hand this way. So it's really good against these combo decks or decks that there's a certain card that is really, really good against us. So these are all the targets for that value grab of Niv Mizzet Reborn, which can end up just being like, I spend 5 mana on Bring to Light, I get a 6/6 flyer, and I put 4 cards in my hand is like a really common thing that happens in the deck. In addition to that, another value grab up of Bring to Light is Valki. Even though the opposite side of Valki is 7 mana, you can actually grab Valki with Bring to Light and then cast the 7 mana side for free. So it's a great value planeswalker, Tibalt Cosmic Imposter. Another value grab is Niv Mizzet Supreme. Flying Hexproof and monocolored, already like pretty good. Each instant sorcery card in your graveyard that's exactly 2 colors has Jumpstart. So this is really good as a value grab. If you've already cast a bunch of these cards specifically, and you're in the deep late game, have a bunch of cards and want to cast them again. And then as a toolbox card, we have Sunfall. So this, we obviously can't grab this with Niv Mizzet, but we can grab it with Bring to Light. Exile all creatures, incubate X or X the number of creatures exiled this way. It's just a really good board wipe. Essentially means we can play 5 with Bring to Light and the 1 Sunfall without diluting our deck too much. The rest of this is like kind of just a mid-range plan. Up the Beanstalk capitalizes on all of these cards that we're casting with mana value 5 or greater, whether it be Leyline Binding that we can cast for 1 mana, but it counts as 5 or greater. The Niv Mizzets, fun fact with the Bring to Lights, you can cast Bring to Light, trigger up the Beanstalk, and then if you grab something that costs 5 or greater, you know, whether it be Tibalt or Niv Mizzet or whatever, it triggers up the Beanstalk again. Just super powerful. Sylvan Caryatid, 2 mana, 0/3, Defender Hexproof, add 1 mana of any color. It's really good because it ramps us, it can't be killed, and it also fixes our colors since we're like a 5-color deck that is running 80 cards, so colors can be awkward sometimes. Fibula Mirrorbreaker is just your amazing mid-range card. It's first chapter, create a 2/2 red goblin shaman creature token with whenever this creature attacks, create a treasure token. Second chapter, discard up to 2 cards. If you do draw that many cards. And third chapter, exile the saga, then return to the battlefield transformed under your control. Its opposite side is Reflection of Kiki-Jiki. You can pay 1 mana and tap it to create a token as a copy of another target non-legendary creature you control, except it has haste, and then you sacrifice it again in a send step and is a 2/2. Card's just amazing. You know, it feels like 3 to 4 cards in one. And so you have to play it like, as a part of a mid-range package. We're playing Leyline Binding as domain, or costs 1 less for each basic land type you control. We often have 5 basic land types, so it very often costs 1. It has flash and it's an O-ring effect. Also triggers up the Beanstalk when we play it. So it's just like a really good combo alongside it, and it answers everything. And then Omnath, which I guess it could be a value grab off of Bring to Light if we really wanted to. But Omnath is a 4 mana 4/4. Whenever it enters, draw a card, so it's really good to bounce with Yorion. And whenever a land you control enters for the first time, gain 4 life. For the second time, get 1 of each color besides black. And for the third time, it deals 4 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker you don't control. This is really, really good alongside just like plain lands because you gain life, also combos with Leyenda. And then also it's really good off of Fable Passage because you can like on turn 5 or whatever, play Omnath, play Fabled Passage, trigger Omnath, gain 4, and then crack Fabled Passage. I get 4 mana, and you can kind of almost like double spell on a turn. You shouldn't be able to double spell these powerful cards. So that is the main deck. That's the overall strategy. Your toolbox in your deck, you're just playing better cards than your opponent, and you're going for it. As far as the sideboard goes, we kind of have to specialize. Fatal Push is very powerful against these aggressive decks, because aggressive decks are pretty good against us. Rest in peace for Graveyard Hate. Dovin's Veto to be able to protect our combo and protect a Bring to Light. Good against counterspell decks and Treasure Cruise decks and whatnot. Camball is a 3 mana 2/3. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, that player loses 2 life, you gain 2 life. Really good against combo decks, really good against Phoenix. Deafening Clarion just for additional cheap board wipe. Another Leyenda, again, because aggressive decks are rugged and having these life linkers that are nearly impossible to be dealt with is very powerful. Yasharm Implacable Earth is a 4 mana 4/4 Selesnya grab, by the way. When Yasharm enters, search your library for a basic forest card and a basic plains card. Reveal those cards, put them into your hand, then shuffle. Players can't pay life or sacrifice non-land permanents to cast spells or activate abilities. This is mostly for Junsack, as it stops the combo, but it can be good against other things. I've already talked about why Yorion's good and why we're playing Yorion, and we're playing a Casualties of War, which is a Golgari grab. Choose 1 or more, destroy target artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker, and you can choose all of them. This is just a very good mid-range card, and again, we can grab it with Niv Mizzet. This is the red-black Sly deck, and as far as the lands go, we're just playing red-black lands that come in untapped, like Sulphurous Sphinx, Blood Crypt, Blackcleave Cliffs, but also red-focused utility lands like Soken'Zon, which is pretty much free, Den of the Bugbear, in case it gets to the late game, you know, we deal chip damage and then they deal with our stuff, we can kill them with our lands. Reminap Ruins to kind of deal that extra damage that's really difficult to interact with, and basic Mountain, because there's plenty of land destruction out there, like Field of Ruin. It's important to grab our basic mountains. Because again, the deck, especially the main deck, is primarily a red deck. And because it's a red aggressive deck, we sort of have to play Kumano Faces Kakazan. It's a 1-mana saga. Its first chapter is it deals 1 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker they control. Its second chapter, which is extremely relevant, especially if we play Kumano Faces Kakazan in turn 1, is the next creature spell you cast this turn, that creature enters with additional +1/+1 counter on it. And its third chapter is it flips into a 2/2 haster with the effect that if a creature dealt damage this turn by a source you control would die, exile it instead. This is strictly our best turn 1 play. All 3 chapters do what we want to do. It gets closer to our opponent being dead, pumps up our creatures, and becomes a creature on its own. Speaking of the creatures we're looking to pump up, let's go through our creature suite. We have Slickshot Show Off, obviously. It's effectively a prowess trigger. When it casts a non-creature spell, it gets +2/+0 until end of turn, and you can plot it, and it's a 1/2 with flying and haste for 2 mana. Now, this is excellent because for every pump spell, like I said, it's a pump spell-y deck, pump spell you cast adds an additional 2 power, even if you cast it on something else. So this is one of the most aggressive, hardest hitting creatures in the deck. And when I first read this card, I was wondering when I would decide to plot it, because it's the same cost as, you know, its normal cost. But you want to be plotting this card when you're looking to do a giant hit the following turn and you're worried about sorcery speed removal. Now, this does signal that you're going to be casting it the following turn, so it gives them a chance to leave up instant speed removal. But against decks like that you're worried about Portable Hole or something like that, like maybe against humans or whatever, then plotting it is almost always better, because sacrificing that 1 damage you might be able to get in if you just cast it normally on turn 2 is way worth it to make sure that you have the card to pump up on turn 3 with all your mana open. We're playing 4 Emberheart Challenger. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with haste and prowess, which again gets pumped up even if you're pumping something else, and Valiant, which is sort of like Heroic except it's spell or ability. So when it becomes a target of a spell or ability for the first time each turn, you exile the top card of your library until end of turn you can play that card. So this is a way to kind of be a reasonable, hasty, awesome, aggressive prowess creature that's really good with our pump spells, but also is extra good with our pump spells because we can dig through our deck and get through even more cards. Play Monastery Swiftspear, which you just have to play in pretty much every red-based aggressive deck. A 1-mana 1/2 with haste and prowess. It gets +1/+1 until end of turn when you cast a non-creature spell. Again, very good with all of our pump spells. And we're playing a Heartfire Hero, which is a 1/1 with Valiant. So whenever it becomes a target of spell or ability for the first time each turn, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So it's awesome to target with your pump spells. However, what makes it even better to target with our pump spells is when it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So, I mean, naturally, you know, we're putting counters on it. Your opponent finally answers it. It deals 3 or maybe 4 damage to the opponent when it dies. But it also counts the pump spells that we are slapping on it. So if we're able to give it trample, like with Monstrous Rage or Ancestral Anger or something like that, plus making its power much higher, it becomes really difficult to block properly. That being said, let's go through our pump spell suite. We have a Titan Strength, which is, I think it's really cool that this card's playable now. 1-mana instant, gives +3/+1 till end of turn, and you scry 1, so we can dig through our deck and have some card selection, and also gives 3 power. It's probably the worst of our pump spells, but it's very good. Monstrous Rage, which is so freaking good, is a 1-mana instant as well. Target creature gets +2/+0 till end of turn, and you create a Monster Roll token attached to it. Monster Roll gives +1/+1 and trample. But remember, it can only have 1 roll at any given time, so multiple Monstrous Rages. Like I think of this card as also +3/+1 and trample, but the second Monstrous Rage on something that already has a Monster Roll token on it doesn't work. So you want to make sure you spread out your monster rolls if you have multiple Monstrous Rage. But great pump spell. Additionally gives trample, indefinite trample and +1/+1, triggering all of the crazy stuff from the creatures. And Ancestral Anger. Ancestral Anger gets +X/+0 till end of turn, where X is 1 plus the number of cards named Ancestral Anger in your graveyard. Often this is just like a pump spell. It's sorcery, but it replaces itself and draws a card, and digging through our deck is really important. And very often it gives extra power, but notably it gives trample and always gives at least 1 power. So this card's very, very good. As far as utility cards go, we're playing a Claim to Fame. We can claim to return these creatures because people are going to side into a ton of removal against this deck. We can claim to return these creatures and keep doing our super aggressive stuff. And then we can Fame as Aftermath to give it not only at haste, but it also be a pump spell in and of itself, just like all of these. And Reckless Rage being a 1 mana 4 damage to target creature you don't control and 2 damage to target creature you control effectively becomes a 1 mana 4 damage to a creature you don't control, trigger Prowess, and often trigger Valiant on Emberheart Challenger, Emberheart Challenger, the Prowess will go off first, which means it'll be dealt 2 damage, but it'll be 3 toughness by the time Reckless Rage goes through. We can trigger Valiant, be able to remove our opponent's creatures, and, same thing with Heartfire Hero. If it already has a counter on it, we put a second counter on it with targeting it with Reckless Rage. It also works with Swift Spear because of the Prowess thing. In the same sense, works with Dreadhorde Arcanist. Oh, I didn't actually talk about Dreadhorde Arcanist, whoops. But it's a great 1 mana removal spell. Dreadhorde Arcanist is pretty sweet. It's a 2 mana 1/3 with trample. Whenever Dreadhorde Arcanist attacks, you may cast target instant sorcery card with mana value less than or equal to Dreadhorde Arcanist's power from your graveyard. Oh, my camera didn't like that. It's okay. Dreadhorde Arcanist won't hurt you. From your graveyard without paying its mana cost, that spell you put in your graveyard, exile it instead. Look at all the 1 mana cards that we could cast, in our graveyard. Dreadhorde Arcanist is a little cute though, because we want to be just killing our opponent, and Dreadhorde Arcanist feels like sort of a plan B card, but a very, very powerful and a must answer plan B card. And then the creme de la creme of this deck is Callous Sellsword. Now, Callous Sellsword is a 2/2 creature, enters with a +1/+1 counter for each creature that died under your control this turn. That's fine. It's fine. If we're playing it as a creature, something's gone wrong, but it's fine. But really, we care about the adventure, Burn Together, where a target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to any other target, then sacrifice it. So the combo of this deck, while it's playing a heroic-y prowess package, where you're pumping things up and trying to kill the opponent as fast as possible, it also has a combo where we're digging through our deck with Ancestral Anger and things like that, and an Emberheart Challenger, to be able to hit a creature that we pump up with Prowess triggers and Valiant triggers, and with our pump spells to make it as big as possible, preferably with trample so it's difficult to block, hit our opponent, say for 7 is a normal amount we hit our opponent for, and then burn together it. So it can be double digits, sometime over 20 damage all in one turn, because sometimes you'll have multiple creatures attacking that have prowess triggers and whatnot. Additionally, the most powerful creature to do this with is Heartfire Hero. So if we have Heartfire Hero, we pump it up with a few different things, get some Valiant triggers, say it gets to 9 power or something like that. Actually, let's say it's even 7 power. Let's say it's not very pumped up. We attack with Heartfire Hero, we pump it up a whole bunch, we get those Valiant triggers, we hit them for a whole bunch. Often if it's trample, we already talked about how difficult Heartfire Hero is to block. Hit them for let's say 7. Then we burn together with Heartfire Hero, deal another 7 damage because that's what his power would be. And then we trigger when Heartfire Hero dies, it deals damage equal to his power to each opponent, another 7 damage. So that combo, this combo is already good with creatures that we're pumping up with our pump spells and prowess and all that stuff, but also absolutely excellent with Heartfire Hero. Is disgusting. Also, notably, it says target creature you control. So the Valiants will trigger off of Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger when you do that as well, and obviously as well as the prowess triggers. So that's how we're killing our opponents. A super aggressive pump spelly deck with an insane fling combo. Now, as far as the sideboard goes, we're playing 4 Fatal Push especially since the new hotness, the mirror match and other aggressive strategies. It's important to remember when you think about sideboarding, I'll make another video about sideboarding. It's important to remember that when you sideboard with this deck, you can't dilute the deck too much. So you got to be really, really careful about sideboarding. Thoughtseize for decks with removal or board wipes or, things we're afraid of, or Beza or stuff, whatever. Another Reckless Rage just for additional removal. Playing a Hazoret the Fervent for against decks that have a lot of interaction for us, and then we expect the games to go super, super long. That's a 4 mana, 5 power haster with Indestructibles. 4 power, 5 mana haster with Indestructible is just excellent. An additional Claim to Fame to bring more things back from the graveyard if we really need to against these removal spell heavy decks. An Obnixilis that we're probably bringing in against a lot of decks that we bring in Hezeret against, just as to diversify our threats, but also to have a more difficult thing to deal with than just like 1 mana and 2 mana creatures. Gigantha, because it is totally free in this deck, and then an Unlicensed Hearse for graveyard. So this is Lotus Field combo in Pioneer. Now what this deck is effectively trying to do is simple. Basically, they're attempting to capitalize on the mana that Lotus Field produces by untapping it and tapping it a whole bunch with things like Hidden Strings and Vizier of Tumbling Sands, and Pour Over Pages for that matter if you have multiple Lotus Fields, to draw a bunch of cards, get a bunch of mana, to eventually either Emergent Ultimatum for a bunch of cards that do really similar things in order to grab Approach the Second Sun, cast Approach the Second Sun, and then cast Dark Petition again, or draw Approach the Second Sun out of our deck and win the game. That's a long and short of what we're attempting to do. Now, the way to get there, it can be kind of hard. So we're going to go over all of these cards. A lot of the cards in our mana base are just like mana producing lands. We have Boseiju and Otawara as spell lands, which are kind of cool because we can grab them with Archdruid's Charm. But the things I really wanted to focus on were Lotus Field and Thespian Stage. So Lotus Field, it is hexproof, which is nice. It can't be destroyed. It enters tapped, and when it enters, sacrifice 2 lands, and you can tap to add 3 mana of any one color. So the default mode of this deck is turn 1, play a land, turn 2, play a land, maybe cast a spell, turn 3, Lotus Field, sack the 2 lands, and now I have this thing that I can untap and get a bunch of mana from. However, you can then play Thespian Stage, where you can pay 2 mana and have it become a copy of target land, and you can have it become a copy of Lotus Field without sacrificing lands, because when it becomes a copy, it doesn't necessarily enter. And there are other ways to kind of like cheat about Lotus Field. So we can search it up with Sylvan Scrying. If we already have a Lotus Field, we're probably searching up Thespian Stage because there's less cost into putting it on the battlefield. And we can search it up with Archdruid's Charm. And Archdruid's Charm is just like a decent utility card and being able to exile artifacts and enchantments, especially since artifacts and enchantments are the cards that are good against our deck, to make sure that we, you know, always have these lands that are required for the beginning of our combo. In addition, we're playing Strict Proctor. That's a 2 mana 1/3 with flying. Whenever a permanent entering causes a triggered ability to trigger, counter that ability unless the controller plays 2. What's kind of interesting about Strict Proctor is this card neuters what the opponent is doing, in addition to making it so Lotus Field doesn't trigger. Even if you have the mana, you can just choose not to pay it. Oh no, it's countered. Which means I don't sack any lands, which is very, very powerful, and people are really realizing that. We're also playing Soul Partition, mostly to be able to deal with permanents that neuter our deck, things like Damping Sphere and whatnot. Fae of Wishes, that we can grab with Emergent Ultimatum as just another way that we can grab Approach from the Second Sun from our graveyard, possibly multiple times if we have time to play it and return it to our hand and whatnot. Once we have that Lotus Field and maybe a Thespian Stage on the battlefield that has copied Lotus Field, we have Hidden Strings in order to tap and untap these lands. We have Vizier of Tumbling Sands in order to profit mana and also be able to churn through our deck. In addition, after we've used some of these cards, we can Ball Again Recovery them back to our hand, which is also very nice. We're playing a Leer, mostly to grab with Emergent Ultimatum, but it allows us to just do everything from our graveyard again, and also when we do that, it can't be countered. Pour Over Pages, I would argue, is the most important card of our deck. Draw 3 cards, untap 2 lands, and discard a card. If we have 2 Lotus Field effects, then we profit 1 mana to drawing 3 cards and discarding a single card, which is excellent, like, because especially since we need to be hitting certain cards like Emergent Ultimatum and Dark Petition, or maybe even Ball Again Recovery or whatever, in order to win the game. So Pour Over Pages is absolutely excellent. We just churn through our deck. Dark Petition I've already talked about. Emergent Ultimatum is another very, very good card. You search your library for up to 3 monocolored cards with different names and exile them. An opponent chooses one of those cards, shuffle that card into your library. You can cast the other cards without paying their mana costs and exile Emergent Ultimatum. So the cards you're normally going to be grabbing with Emergent Ultimatum is some combination of Omniscience, Dark Petition, Leer, and Fae of Wishes. Sometimes if some of them are in the graveyard already, we'll grab a Ball Again Recovery as well, or maybe even Pour Over Pages. But the goal of this Emergent Ultimatum is to create a ultimatum pile that your opponent is dead no matter what they choose to shuffle back in. So for example, if I have a ridiculous amount of mana and I go Emergent Ultimatum, let's go Omniscience, Dark Petition, Leer, right? They can shuffle Omniscience in, and Dark Petition and Leer get cast for free. With Dark Petition, I just grab Approach, Leer, put on the battlefield, cast these hidden strings from my graveyard or whatever, and be able to get that mana back and cast all these other spells from my graveyard. Dark Petition for that Approach, cast a bunch of spells, cast Dark Petition from my graveyard again, grab Approach from my library, cast it, we win, right? Or something to that effect. As you play more Lotus Field, the piles that you're going to make become more and more important, and I would argue are one of the harder parts about this deck. And then, like I already mentioned, Omniscience, it's mostly just to be able to grab with Emergent Ultimatum to make it miserable. These piles really, really difficult. Something to note about Omniscience, though, that I'll probably mention in my nuances video as well, is that only spells cast from your hand you can play without paying the mana cost, which means that the cards that you cast from the graveyard with Leer aren't free. As far as our sideboard goes, a lot of this is a wish board, meaning that sometimes, especially post board, you're going to run into hate cards that mean that you probably can't combo, but you can still grab cards with Fae of Wishes and Dark Petition that can win the game for you without casting Approach twice. So let's kind of go over these things. So Silence is really good to side in against counterspell decks. You can, before you attempt a combo, you can just like cast Silence. And then if your opponent doesn't counter that Silence, then you can just combo off, or it just eats a counterspell. 9 Lives is really good against aggressive decks and decks that you just need way more time against. Temporary Lockdown, again, but mostly aggressive decks that have a lot of permanents that are cost 2 or less. Depopulate is just a solid board wipe that you can grab. We already talked about Approach. Sphinx of the Final Word is very good against counterspell decks. It can't be countered itself and means that other things can't be countered, and also you can't really answer it. And the mana doesn't really matter because we have the Lotus Fields. And so either grabbing or siding in Sphinx of the Final Word is very powerful. Glistening Deluge is a board wipe. Path of Peril is a board wipe. Voyaging Satyr is really fun because it sort of acts like a 2-mana Vizier that we can't cycle, where we can just untap the land. Very good against decks that we kind of need to be sort of turbo against. Dragonlord Jamoka, spell can't be countered, opponent can't cast spells during your turn. Just a really, really good lifelink finisher, and is very good against counterspells. Zakama, another very good finisher, especially since when you cast it, you untap all the lands you control, which means the Lotus Fields. So really good against like creature-based decks, lets you gain a bunch of life pretty much immediately and just win the game. And then we're playing another Emergent Ultimatum if we're in a situation where we need to like Dark Petition for another Emergent Ultimatum. We can grab it from our sideboard. So this is 5-color Enigmatic Incarnation. And the first thing you need to understand about this deck is that there are 2 major combos happening. The first combo is the namesake of the deck, Enigmatic Incarnation, which is a 4-mana enchantment. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another enchantment. If you do, search your library for a creature card with mana value equal to 1 plus the sacrificed enchantment's mana value, put that onto the battlefield, then shuffle. So you can combo this with basically any enchantment in the deck. So for example, if you sacrifice a Nowhere to Run or an Up the Beanstalk, you can grab Kutziel's Flanker, Skyclave Apparition, or Zur. If you sacrifice an Overlord of the Hauntwood, you can grab a Linvala or an Overlord of the Boreal Bilges. If you sacrifice a Leyline Binding or Overlord of the Boreal Bilges, you can grab a Overlord of the Mistmoors or an Atraxa. And this is extremely powerful, especially if the enchantments are just sitting on the battlefield, having already done their thing and not really doing anything else. It allows us to totally toolbox our deck, which is very cool. The other combo in our deck is centered around Zur Eternal Schemer. Zur Eternal Schemer is a 3-mana 1/4 flying. Enchantment creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. And you can pay 2 mana, 1 white, 1 generic, to have target non-aura enchantment you control become a creature in addition to its other types, and has base power and toughness equal to its mana value. So this is already good in a deck with a lot of enchantments, right? You can man up an Enigmatic for a 4/4, man up one of these for a 2/2, man up a Leyline Binding for a 6/6, but it's especially good alongside the Overlords for 2 reasons. The first reason, and maybe the obvious reason, is they are enchantment creatures in and of themselves. And so if you just have an Overlord and are attacking with an Overlord, it has Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof, which is excellent. The less obvious reason, and the very, very cool reason, is if you impend any of these Overlords, they are not creatures, but they are enchantments. They have done their thing. So you can pay the 2 mana on Zur to make an impended overlord an enchantment. So let's say you do it to Overlord of the Hauntwoods. Say you impend Overlord, get your 4th land, untap, play your 5th land, play Zur, man up Overlord of the Hauntwoods. It is now a 5/5, even though the creature is a 6/5. Because it was manned up with Zur, it is now a 5/5 with Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. And it says nothing about while it's impended that it doesn't have the other text on the card. So when it attacks, it still triggers the text on the card. That is same true with drawing cards off of Flood Pits and getting 2 insects with Mistmores, even if it is still impended, which is absolutely absurd. Speaking of the Overlords, to talk about each of these cards as, individually. Overlord of the Flood Pits, you can impend for 3 or play for 5 as a 5/3 with flying. And when it enters, again, even if you impend it or attacks, draw 2 cards and discard a card. Very good for filtering out like bad cards, because unfortunately we have to play a lot of bad cards because we're a combo deck. Overlord of the Hauntwoods is a 5-mana 6/5 with impending 4. And when it enters or attacks, create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere. That is every basic land type. And Overlord of the Mistmores is a 7-mana 6/6 with impending 4. When Overlord of the Mistmores enters or attacks, create 2/2/1 white insect creature tokens with flying. All these cards very good in and of themselves, even better with Zur, and even extra better with Enigmatic Incarnation. So let's talk about all the other cards in the deck that have less to do with the combo and why we're playing these cards. Playing 4 Fatal Push, we're playing black anyway because of Zur, and this deck is a little susceptible to aggressive decks, even if Zur gives lifelink, so it's important to play the Fatal Push to stop those aggressive strategies. Same thing with Nowhere to Run. The cool part about Nowhere to Run as well, though, is yes, it has that additional, creatures your opponent control, don't have hexproof and ward basically, but it also kills a creature, and also it isn't really doing anything on just sitting on the battlefield, so it's really easy to sacrifice to Enigmatic Incarnation to grab one of these 3-drops. Play for Up the Beanstalk. Obviously, the cool combo thing that's happening with Up the Beanstalk is, it draws a card when it enters, but also if you impend any of the Overlords or cast Leyline Binding for 1 mana, even though it says 5 mana, you will still draw a card off of Up the Beanstalk, even if you're only paying 3 mana for Overlord of the Hauntwoods. So a really good start is like turn 2 Up the Beanstalk, turn 3 impend Overlord, draw a card, get an extra land, go. And we're playing 4 Vanishing Verse. Vanishing Verse is excellent in the mirror match and is just very good in Pioneer at the moment, and just like a pretty unconditional removal spell. As far as our 3-drops go, they are mostly targets for our 2-drops. So as far as our toolbox cards, we have Kutziel's Flanker, 3 mana, 3/1. That is a little bit of everything. It's good Graveyard Hate we're able to play in the main deck because we can search it up. It's decent against aggro. He's gained 2 life, scry 2, and the last one's fine against board wipes. I don't think I've ever used the first mode on Kutziel's Flanker, to be totally honest with you. Skyclave Apparition is decent removal, being able to exile a permanent 4 or less, and then when it leaves the battlefield, they get a Excise Illusion creature token for X the mana value of the exiled card. And they're playing 4 Zur, which we also very often search up by sacrificing these enchantments, but we've already talked about the Zur and why we're playing it in the combos. We've already talked about Enigmatic Incarnation as well as the Overlords. We're playing 4 Leyline Binding. Leyline Binding, we're playing 5 colors anyway. We're a 4-color deck, but Everywhere off of Overlord of the Hauntwoods is every basic land type, so it can make, give us the red mana for Leyline Binding. So often costs 2, sometimes costs 1, and it's just an O-ring effect with flash. It's very, very good. Also triggers off the Beanstalk and everything. We're playing a Linvala the Preserver. Linvala the Preserver is a target for sacrificing one of these 5-mana Overlords. 6 mana, 5/5 with flying. When Linvala the Preserver enters, if an opponent has more life than you, gain 5 life. When it enters, if an opponent controls more creatures than you, get a 3/3 white green angel creature token. So it's a way to catch up, because remember, we're a little susceptible and a little slow compared to aggro decks. And Overlord of the Boreal Villages is a 6 mana, 5/5 with impending 4. When it enters or attacks, it deals 4 damage to any target. It's really hard for us to cast this besides off of Cavern of Souls and off of Overlord of the Hauntwoods, which is why we're only paying 1 to grab off of an Enigmatic Incarnation. I've already talked about Overlord of the Mistmores. So Atraxa is pretty much a game ender. Sacrificing an Overlord of the Boreal Villages or a Leyline Binding is a 7 mana 7/7 with Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink, and when it enters, reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand and put the rest in the bottom of your library random order. Very often this draws like 4 cards, sometimes 5 cards. It is absolutely disgusting and very often ends the game because it also is a threat in and of itself and is very, very, very good at blocking. As far as the sideboard goes, the first thing I wanted to mention that I think is a little obvious at this point that I'm surprised I didn't mention before is this is a Yorion deck, which means we play 20 more cards in the main deck. And the reason it's a Yorion deck is because it combos insanely well with an enchantment deck. For example, we can bounce Nowhere the Run to give an extra -3/-3 and extra removal, but also is especially good alongside the Overlords, because if we have an impended Overlord and we bounce it with Yorion, it comes back as not impended, still triggers the Overlord trigger, but it comes back just as the creature, which is really game ending very, very, very often. We're playing 4 Thoughtseize for combo decks and decks that are good at neutering what we do, control decks, whatever. Playing 2 Rest in Peace, decent enchantment, but also graveyard hate. 1 Archon of Emeria to be able to throw into the 3-drop slot to tutor out for these combo decks and whatnot. 4 Knockout Blow, because like I said, it is a very, very tough matchup, is the red aggressive deck is. We're playing 1 Elishnorn, Mother of Machines, very good against the mirror match, but also very good in our deck because a lot of these things have Enter the Battlefield abilities I can trigger twice. 1 Thought Distortion, again, for really anything that plays a lot of instant sorceries that the game goes long. And 1 Rurik Thar the Unbowed, very good against these decks that play a lot of non-creature spells that we can tutor out in the 6-drop slot. So this is your average blue-white control deck. I actually played blue-white control at the RC this past weekend. I was playing the Yorion version, so it wasn't exactly this 75. But this is what you'll see most of the time people playing blue-white control. So let's start with the lands. We're playing a Castle Ardenvale because we're trying to hit as many land drops as possible. Notice we're running 27. That's a pretty land-heavy deck. And we always want something to do with our mana. And so creating a 1/1 white human, if we have an extra 5 mana or extra 4 mana plus Castle Ardenvale, is pretty strong. Deserted Beach is a Azorius land that comes in untapped if you control 2 or more other lands. So as long as you don't play it on the first or second turn, it is essentially a dual land. An Aganjo, mostly just because it's free. These spell lands are very powerful. Field of Ruin is excellent in this deck because, again, we always want ways to use our mana. And there's a lot of really powerful lands, both in the mirror matches and basically against every deck. And so being able to just stop that when we want to use our mana anyway is pretty strong. Floodfarm Verge is one of the new Azorius lands. It comes in untapped all the time and only taps for white. However, if you control plains or an island, it taps for a blue as well. And frankly, white is the most important color in this deck, at least in the first few turns, and it taps for blue most of the time in most games. Fountain Port is one of the most surprising, powerful cards to me, or in most recently printed cards. Again, you always want to be using all of your mana. And so you can pay 3 mana and 1 life to create a 1/1 blue fish creature token. And that's just like pretty awesome. It applies a threat similar to Castle Ardenvale. However, you can pay 2 mana and sacrifice a token to draw a card. So that includes the human token you make with Castle Ardenvale. That includes the fish token you make with Fountain Port. The paying 4 mana, create a treasure token. That includes that token. It includes the map you make with Restless Anchorage. It includes the samurai you make with Wandering Emperor, etc., etc. Even fishes you make with Beza, whatever. And so this allows you to really outcard your opponent while using your mana in an efficient way. Call the Storm Giants as a one-of to just close out games against Control and Phoenix and things like that. It's a little bit worse against Control because of Fountain Port, but it's still very strong. Playing 4 Hallowed Fountain, just a Azorius Shockland, coming in untaps, all important. 2 Island and 2 Plains. Otawara as another one of our spell lands just because it's free, and then 2 Restless Anchorage just as more manned lands. We're only playing 2 because it's really important these things come in untapped in this like really aggressive aggro meta, and so we don't want to play too many Restless Anchorage in that capacity. I'm going to rearrange this deck just a little bit to make it a little bit easier to talk about. Okay, so I divided these up into 5 piles, denoting kind of the different roles that each one of these cards has. We're playing 2 Dovin's Veto with the other 2 in the sideboard because there's a bunch of powerful non-creature spells, whether it be the Mirror Match or the Enigmatic deck or whatever. Normalize is just a harder to cast mana leak, and it gets exiled instead of put into the graveyard, which is pretty relevant, like against things like Memory Delusion, whatever. 3 Steps Ahead is a really interesting card. You pay 1 mana for it and then pay additional costs depending on what you want for it. It's a pretty bad rate if you are always doing one of these things, but all of the things are actually very relevant. You can pay an additional blue and generic to counter a target spell. So it's can just be a cancel. You can pay an extra 3 mana to create a token that's a copy of target artifact or creature you control, which is pretty cool alongside like Hullbreaker Horror, because notice it's not until end of turn. And you can pay an additional 2 generic to draw 2 cards and discard a card. And you can do as many of these as you want. So a very common play pattern is using the cancel and the draw 2 discard 2 for 5 mana. It's effectively like a kind of medium cryptic command, right? My opponent casts a spell, I pay 5 mana, counter that spell, draw 2, discard 1. This is a very powerful effect. Though again, if you're only using one of these effects, it's not a very good card. We're playing 2 High Noon. This is very good against the Phoenix deck and very good against the Slickshot Show-Off decks. Also pretty good against Mono Green with them plotting Outcast or Trailblazers and things like that. This is our removal suite. We're playing 2 Temporary Lockdown, which is very good against these aggressive decks and against the sack deck. We're playing 2 Get Loss, where we pay 2 mana to destroy target creature, enchantment, or planeswalkers. Controller creates 2 maps. Just having decent instant speed removal is awesome, and normally we don't care about the maps that we're giving our opponent. We're playing a Farewell. Just being able to reset the game with just a 1-of is pretty powerful, though 6 mana is quite a lot of mana. We're playing 4 March of Otherworldly Light, where white and X, exile target artifact, creature, enchantment with mana value X or less. And we can exile any number of white cards from our hand to have it cost 2 less to cast for each exiled this way. This is just the best removal spell in the deck by a lot. It allows us to kill manlands for just 1 mana. It can kill tokens for just 1 mana. It answers enchantments as well. That's just so powerful. And 2 Supreme Verdict just as a can't be countered, destroy all creatures. As far as kill conditions, besides these manlands that we're playing 4 Wandering Emperor. Wandering Emperor has a -1 where we create a 2/2 white samurai creature token with vigilance, which is awesome. We can also put +1 to put a +1/+1 counter up to 1 target creature against first strike till end of turn, which is pretty cute. And a really common mode of this is it's -2 exile target tapped creature, you gain 2 life. So a really common way to play Wandering Emperor is they attack with a big creature. You play Wandering Emperor, exile that creature, untap, either kill the Wandering Emperor to create a 2/2 or plus to put a second loyalty counter on it. And then just start making samurais and protecting Wandering Emperor and killing your opponent. It's also really good to cast Wandering Emperor just into nothing, just to start putting on pressure and force your opponent to do stuff. And then this last category is card advantage. So we're playing 2 Teferi Hero Dominaria. The reason we're only playing 2 is 5 mana is a lot of mana to tap at sorcery speed. But once it's on the battlefield, we can plus it to draw a card and at the end step, untap 2 lands. So we can like tap out for it on 5, draw a card, and then be able to leave up something like Get Lost or a counterspell or something like that. It's -3 is put target non-land permanent into its own library 3rd from the top. So we just tuck it into the deck. And then if we're able to get to its ultimate, you get an emblem with whenever you draw a card, exile target permanent an opponent controls. And if you ever do that, you kind of just win the game. Playing a 1 of Narset, stopping our opponent from drawing more than 1 card each turn is super powerful, whether it be against Mono Green or against Phoenix. I'm sure there are other decks is excellent against, good against like Lotus and whatever. But then we get to -2 loyalty, so we can activate it twice. If you look at the top 4 cards of your library, you may reveal a non-creature, non-land card from among them and put into your hand the rest of the body of your library in a random order. Very powerful. Playing 3 Memory Deluge, where we can look at the top X cards of your library, where X is the amount of mana spent to cast this spell. Put 2 of them in your hand, the rest of the body of your library in a random order. What's beautiful about this is this pairs so well with Wandering Emperor. You know, if they do something scary, we Wandering Emperor. If not, we Memory Deluge. It's just so good. So good. And then being able to flash it back for 7 mana, which means we look at the top 7 cards and grab 2. So it's a great card advantage engine and just pairs really nicely with the rest of our deck. And we're playing 2 Deduce, which is basically a better Think Twice. We can pay 2 mana, draw a card, and Investigate, which creates a clue where at some point in the future, we can pay another 2 mana, sacrifice the clue, and draw a card. And so with all of these things, what we're trying to do is stop our opponent from doing the thing and then slowly kill our opponent once they burn out. It is your basic archetypal blue-white control deck. That being said, our sideboard, we already talked about High Noon, just very good against these decks that want to cast multiple spells a turn, whether it be Lotus, Phoenix, the Slickshot aggro decks, Mono Green, whatever. Knockout Blow is for these red aggressive decks. Beza is really good against everything except for anything you would consider a combo. So I think it's very good against the aggro decks because it gains life and creates blockers. It's essentially just like a timely reinforcement creature where you create a treasure token if opponent controls more lands than you. You gain 4 life if opponent has more life than you, and create 2 1/1 blue frick creature tokens if opponent has more creatures than you, and draw a card if your opponent has more cards in hand than you. So I think it's good against mid-range as well because it can happen to draw a card, and just like having creatures post-board against mid-range when they're forced to bring out removal, I think is very powerful. And then also for a similar reason, pretty good in the mirror match. Like if we can play this card and then draw a card from it, it's a threat and we draw a card. Every single card matters in these control mirrors. And so Beza is really strong. It's just not very good against the combo decks. Aether Gust, 2 mana instant, choose target spell, a permanent that's red or green. Its owner puts it on top and bottom of their library. We play this card against like the mono green deck and against the red aggressive decks. Mystical Dispute for these other blue decks, whether it be the Mirror Match or Spirits or Lotus Combo or whatever. 3 mana counter target spell unless control pays 3, and it costs 2 less to cast if it targets a blue spell. Playing 1 Shark Typhoon, which adds a good mid-range killer and a decent card to help fix our land drops and apply pressure in the mirror match and stuff. Where it's an enchantment where whenever we cast a non-creature spell, put an XX blue shark creature token with flying where X that spell's mana value. So it's a great finisher. But we can cycle it for 1 blue, 1 generic, and 1 X. And when you cycle it, which you draw a card when you cycle, create an XX blue shark creature token with flying. Hullbreaker Horror is another just like awesome kill condition against these mid-range decks and these control decks. Is also decent against combo if you're able to get there. Against most combo decks, you can't really get there, though. It's really, really hard to. Dovin's Veto, again, for these non-creature decks. We already talked about it when we talked about the main deck, Dovin's Veto. And then Kahira, just because it's free, and just having another threat, just like on a stick, even if we side in the Beza, just excellent. The only thing it doesn't get along with is Hullbreaker Horror, but that is totally fine. I think if you really want access to Kahira, you could totally just play a second Shark Typhoon instead of Hullbreaker Horror. I just think Hullbreaker Horror is just so good in the mirror match that we want to keep it. But if you're playing the 75 and side in Hullbreaker Horror, be sure to not reveal Kahira. You will lose. So Martyr Greasefang is fully based around putting a vehicle, preferably Parhelion, but Sky Sovereign is fine as well, into the graveyard, and then casting Greasefang and going to combat. Now Greasefang is a 4/3 for 3 that says at the beginning of combat in your turn, return target vehicle card from your graveyard to the battlefield, it gains haste. Return to its owner's hand at the beginning of the next end step. Now, when you do this with Parhelion, which again is the dream, you go to combat, Parhelion returns to the battlefield. Parhelion is flying first strike vigilance. Whenever Parhelion 2 attacks, create 2 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance that are attacking, and conveniently it has crew 4. So in beginning of combat, Parhelion returns to the battlefield. You use Greasefang or something else if you want to man it up, and then attack with Parhelion. It is 13 damage, and the 2 4/4 angels remain on the battlefield, and you get to keep your Greasefang. Parhelion returns to your hand, but that's like totally fine. That's the combo. That's what we're trying to do. You can do the same thing with Sky Sovereign, except it just deals effectively 6 damage to opponent's creatures. Because 1 for entering, 1 for the attack, and then it returns to your hand. And then you can replay Sky Sovereign, which is kind of cool. It's more realistic to replay Sky Sovereign than replay Parhelion, but that's what we're trying to do here. So how do we do that? Well, we have a Mardu mid-range shell that just happens to discard a lot of cards to be able to put these Parhelion and Sky Sovereigns into our graveyard. Specifically, we're playing Fear of Missing Out. Fear of Missing Out is a 2 mana 2/3. When it enters, discard a card, then draw a card, so preferably discarding one of these vehicles. And when it attacks for the first time each turn, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, which is pretty easy to do because we have artifacts and enchantments and creatures and instants and sorceries, untap target creature. After this phase, it's an additional combat phase. That is disgusting with Parhelion and Greasefang. So like the nutty nut hand is like turn 1 Thoughtseize or Fatal Push your opponent's creature. Fear of Missing Out, discard Parhelion, mill a bunch of cards with like Overlord or something like that, get Delirium, Greasefang, man up Parhelion, and then take 2 combat phases with Fear of Missing Out. So good. Bloodtithe Harvester is another just really good mid-range card, but also a discard outlet. It is a 2 mana 3/2 and enters, create a blood token where we can pay 1, discard a card, and draw a card, which again, that's what we're attempting to do. And we can sacrifice Bloodtithe Harvester to have a creature get -X until end of turn, where X is twice the number of blood tokens you control, and we can activate only as a sorcery. Just very good by itself, but also it kind of goes along with our plan. Fable of Mirrorbreaker is another discard outlet. I'm going to go through Fable of Mirrorbreaker, but if you play Pioneer, you know what this does. It's a 3 mana saga. First chapter is create a 2/2 red goblin shaman creature token. Whenever this creature attacks, create a treasure token. Its second chapter is discard up to 2 cards. You draw that many cards. So again, we're discarding. And third chapter is it turns into Reflection of Kiki Jiki, which is a 2/2, where we can pay 1 and tap it to create a token that's a copy of another target non-legendary creature you control, except it gains haste, sacrifice it, they get into the next end step. And that can combo with, you know, Greasefang, with Blood Tithe Harvester, with Fear of Missing Out. We can even copy an Overlord. It's just very, 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 very good. But the big thing here is that this card is good by itself, and it discards cards so that we can get these vehicles into the graveyard, just like all of these cards. Now, the last card that we use to get vehicles into the graveyard is Overlord of the Baelmerk. It is a 5-mana 5/5. When Overlord of the Baelmerk enters or attacks, mill 4 cards. Then you may return a non-avatar creature card or planeswalker card from your graveyard to your hand, which means every creature but itself it can return. So it's a great way to get a Greasefang that had been killed before combat or something like that back to your hand. You can also mill a Greasefang and get it in your hand so that you can cast it. It also puts those great vehicles in the graveyard. It also has Impending for 2 mana, so you can cast it on turn 2, mill 4 cards, return a creature card, right? Any of these to your hand, and it's just excellent. So these are the combos, but again, notice besides this category, all of these cards are just like very good mid-range cards by themselves. So we're in a mid-range shell while we're threatening this really nasty combo. Now, to support that mid-range strategy, we're playing Akroxa. Akroxa is 2 mana 6/6. When it enters, sacrifice it unless it escaped. And when it enters or attacks, each opponent discards a card. Then each opponent who didn't discard a non-land card this way loses 3 life. And we can escape it for 4 mana and exiling 5 other cards from your graveyard. Just a very good mid-range card if the game goes really long. We're playing 2 Vanishing Verse in the main deck. Exile target monocolored permanent. Vanishing Verse has gained a lot of stock recently. There's a lot of very scary monocolored permanents. Playing 1 Bitter Triumph, just being able to deal with the planeswalker or creature for effectively no cost is awesome. Torch the Tower is just a decent removal spell. Being able to deal with small creatures or phoenixes like forever. We're playing 3 Fatal Push in the main deck, just as a 1 mana destroy creature with mana value 2 or less, or mana value 4 or less if a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, which is reasonably easy between the treasures and the blood tokens and whatnot. And then 4 Thoughtseize. Obviously, if you're playing a mid-range deck that's playing black, you just have to play these Thoughtseize. 1 mana, target player reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card, and you lose 2 life. As far as the mana base goes, there's not a lot of interesting stuff going on. Playing an Elegant Parlor, and Elegant Parlor is kind of cute because we can, like, if we hit a vehicle off the Surveil, we can put it in the graveyard really easily. Also, Takenuma is actually like generally good in the deck. It effectively does a similar thing as Overlord of the Baelmerk. We can discard it from our hand, pay 4 mana, and mill 3 cards, and return a creature or planeswalker card from a graveyard to our hand. So just another way to get Greasefang back. But it's just Mardu lands. Not a lot of interesting stuff. We want things to enter untapped. As far as our sideboard goes, we're playing 2 Portable Holes for permanents we care about with mana value 2 or less. An Elish Norn to neuter those decks that have a lot of enter the battlefield abilities. So like what immediately pops in my head is like Leyline Binding decks. 3 Duress. I don't know why they're different arts. I apologize for that. For combo decks, control decks, anything that is a lot of the decks duressable. We're playing a single Fatal Push just to round out our playset against these decks that we can kill things with Fatal Push. A Braid is, a decent creature kill for 2 mana. Also, destroying artifacts is very powerful. We're finishing out a playset of Vanishing Verse for decks that's good against. Reckoner Bankbuster is against these decks that the game is going to go long, and we need to make sure that our mid-range plan is even better and we can drive in more cards. And we're playing 2 Unlicensed Hearse as our graveyard hate. This is the mono green deck in Pioneer. The main deck is pretty set in stone and stock. The sideboard, there's a little bit of wiggle room, but let's start with the lands. We're running a ton of forests. Coming untapped, can't be touched by scary things like Field of Ruin and whatever is all very important. 2 Boseiju, on color, main deck, artifact and enchantment hate is also very important. We're playing a 1 of Sunken Citadel because between Lair of the Hydra, Boseiju, and Nykthos, we have a lot of lands that want to be activated for really cheap. But the issue is coming to play tapped really matters with this deck. So we're just doing it as a fun of one of. We're playing 2 Lair of the Hydra, another on-color land that comes into play untapped if we play it early. And we can play green and X to have it become an XX Hydra creature. That is still a land, which is very relevant because sometimes we will run out of gas but have a ton of mana, and we can finish them off with Lair of the Hydra. Unfortunately, Lair of the Hydra does not have trample, so meh. And we're playing the kind of big shot card of the deck, the card that this deck wouldn't exist without, Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, which taps for colorless. However, we can pay 2 mana, tap it, and choose a color, and add an amount of mana of that color equal to your devotion to that color. So this entire deck is based around Nykthos and making an obscene amount of mana with Nykthos Shrine to Nyx. So let's go through the cards in our deck. I'm just going to go by mana cost. So we're playing a playset of each of the green mana dorks, 4 Llanowar Elves, 4 Elvish Mystic, both because it's a 1 mana and we add a devotion for just 1 mana, but also because we want to ramp our mana as fast as possible so that we can cast our other spells as fast as possible. Playing a 1 of Oath of Nissa. This can also be replaced with a Polukranos, but I like Oath of Nissa to help smooth out the draws. Also, it exists on the battlefield as a devotion. We're playing 4 Invasion. Whoop. Can I not look at it? Oh, I'm freezing. Okay, there. We're playing 4 Invasion of Ixalan. When it enters, look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may reveal a permanent card from among them, put into your hand, put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order. That's our whole deck. They're all permanents besides Storm the Festival. So we look at the top 5 cards and just put a card that isn't Storm the Festival into our hand, which is just excellent, smooths out the draws, but it can also be attacked and turned into a 4/3 with trample. That can gain indestructible when we cast a spell, which is making combat a lot better. Also notably, it adds devotion. Playing Outcaster Trailblazer. It's a 3 mana 4/2. When it enters the battlefield, add a mana of any color. Whenever another creature you control with power 4 or greater enters, draw a card, which is excellent because we're playing a lot of big dumb dummies. And we can plot for 3 mana as well. You'd want to plot this card if you are worried about it getting removed or are not using the mana immediately, because very often getting mana and getting as many creatures on the battlefield as possible and drawing as many cards as possible is the best part and most important part of this deck. We are playing 4 Old Growth Troll, mostly because it's efficiently costed. It's 3 green pips for Nykthos, but also it's a 3 mana 4/4, and it's very easy for us to get those green pips. And when it dies, we can return it to the battlefield as an aura with Enchant Forest, where the Enchanted Forest has tap, add 2 green, and we can pay 1 mana and tap it and sacrifice the land to create a 4/4 Troll Warrior creature token with trample, so we can kind of make another one. What's really relevant about that is the aura is also triple green, because literally the card is returning, so it can continue to add devotion while having those abilities in the land. So it makes it actually a pretty difficult card to remove from the battlefield. Playing 4 Ikora Behemoth Beckoner. It's a 7 loyalty planeswalker for 3 mana. When a creature you control with power 4 or greater enters, draw a card. So it's a similar ability as Outcaster Trailblazer. And we can -1 to untap target permanent. Sometimes we're going to be doing this to creatures. Most of the time, we're going to be doing this to Nykthos. So we can activate Nykthos for a whole mess of mana, untap it, activate it again for another whole mess of mana. And its static ability is very relevant in this deck, just like Outcaster Trailblazer. We're playing 2 Ulvenwald Oddity. This is one of the cards in the combo, and I'll explain the combo after I get done explaining the cards. It's a 4 mana 4/4 with Trample Haste, and we can transform it for 7 mana. When it's transformed, it's an 8/8 with Trample Haste, and other creatures you control get +1/+1 and have Trample and Haste. We're playing 4 Leyline of the Guild Pact. This card doesn't do a lot for our deck. It color fixes us for Elesh Norn, which is kind of cool. We'll talk about Elesh Norn in just a sec. But the main thing that it does is we can put it onto the battlefield in our opening hand and then immediately have 4 devotion, which creates sort of a nut draw where we can be activating Nykthos as early as turn 2 if we played a turn 1 mana dork. We can be activating Nykthos for 5 and casting Cavalier of Thorns as early as turn 2, which is really hard for our opponents to deal with. And so devoting 4 slots to having a really high-powered nut hand is very relevant. Speaking of Cavalier is a 5 mana with 3 green pips, 5/6. With reach, when it enters, you reveal the top 5 cards of your library. Put a land card from among them onto the battlefield and the rest into your graveyard. And when it dies, you can exile it if you do put target card from your graveyard on top of your library. So similar to Old Growth Troll, it's 3 green pips, and very annoying to remove, because if you remove it from anything that isn't exile, you can put cards that like really matter on top of your library. Like if you already have a Cavalier in your graveyard, you can put it on top of your library and keep providing threats, or Storm the Festival, or whatever, which is extremely powerful. In addition, notice that the land enters the battlefield untapped, so you can very much like at some point in the game add a bunch of mana with Nykthos, use it to cast Cavalier. Cavalier adds an additional 3 green pips, grab a Nykthos with the Cavalier trigger, be able to activate the Nykthos again and add even more mana, which is just adds this crazy perpetual thing. And the last engine of the deck is Storm the Festival. It's a 6 mana sorcery. Look at the top 5 cards of your library. You may put 2 permanent cards with mana value 5 or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest in the bottom of your library in a random order, and has flashback for 10 mana. 10 mana, not a big deal once we get rolling with this, but really this allows us to put all these super powerful permanents on the battlefield, increasing our devotion and continuing this thing. Also notice increasing that devotion matters, because then we can flashback Storm the Festival and just put a ridiculous amount of creatures on the battlefield. Also notice it's permanent, so we can be grabbing Nykthos if we really want to. We're kind of sad if we're grabbing a land, but it's still very good. Now let's talk about how this deck actually works, because I mentioned that it's a combo deck. Now, part of the combo is just making a ton of mana with Nykthos, untapping Nykthos with Kiora, making even more mana, casting Storm the Festival a whole bunch, like blah 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 blah. But what can happen with this deck is once we have a lot of mana with Nykthos, we can begin to be casting Outcaster Trailblazers and Kioras, so that whenever we cast an Old Growth Troll, an Ulvenwald Oddity, or a Cavalier of Thorns, or another Outcaster Trailblazer, we're drawing cards. And as we draw cards, we're filling up our hand, which allows us to do things like play a second Nykthos, or untap the Nykthos with Kiora, to create even more mana, or cast even more Storm the Festivals, or play a Cavalier to eventually hit another Nykthos. Or once we're rolling, the big reason we're playing Invasion instead of Oath of Nissa, being able to play Invasion to dig for another Nykthos, and be able to put a ridiculous amount of permanence on the battlefield because we have an obscene amount of mana and are drawing an obscene amount of cards from Kiora and Outcaster Trailblazer, untapping Nykthos, tapping it for more mana, getting another Nykthos onto the battlefield, tapping it for more mana, playing 2 or 3 Cavaliers because we've cast a bunch of Storm the Festivals and drawn a bunch of Outcaster Trailblazers and Kioras, eventually hitting like a 3rd Nykthos, tapping it for an obscene amount of mana, until eventually we hit Ulvenwald Oddity while we have 10 creatures on the battlefield, between Outcaster Trailblazers, Mana Dorks, Old Growth Trolls, and Cavalier of Thorns. We get Ulvenwald Oddity out of the battlefield when we have a ridiculous amount of mana. We transform it. Everything gets +1/+1 trample and haste, and we swing for 40+. And that is the new combo of the deck. Besides that, the secondary mode of it is just a green beatdown deck that creates a ton of mana. But it can just win out of nowhere if you have a Kiora or an Outcaster Trailblazer on the battlefield, plus a lot of green pips. Now, as far as the sideboard goes, we're playing an Elesh Norn Mother of Machines. You probably noticed that Elesh Norn is off color. So this can be fixed for a couple different ways once we side Elesh Norn in. First off, Sunken Citadel, we can just name white. So that's one piece of color fixing. Second off, when we play an Outcaster Trailblazer, we can just add a white mana to get Elesh Norn onto the battlefield. Third off, if we have a Leyline of Guildpact on the battlefield, everything taps for every color anyway, so we can just use white mana. And then also, it can just be grabbed with Storm the Festival. So there are so many ways to get Elesh Norn on the battlefield, even though it's off color, that it is totally worth it to bring in, because not only does it amplify our effects, like the end of the battlefield draw card effects, Cavalier effects, invasion effects, oath effects, all that stuff. But we're bringing it in against decks that also have a lot of enter the battlefield effects, and we can just turn that off. We're bringing it against decks that really rely on it. Playing Pick Your Poison for our artifact and enchantment hate a little bit, but also flying creature hate. In addition to artifact and enchantment hate, we're playing Scrap Shooter, where we can, it's a 3-mana 4/4 with 2 green pips, already totally fine with reach, which is also very relevant against all of these Slickshot show-off decks. And when it enters, we can gift a card, so let them draw a card, just write an artifact or enchantment opponent controls. Because of all these aggro decks, we're also playing Setessan Petitioner, I can barely ever say that. 3 mana with 2 green pips, 2/2, and enters, you gain life equal to your devotion to green, which can be a million. Playing Aresta, the Endless Web. It's a 4-mana 3/5 with 2 green pips with Reach. When opponent casts an instant sorcery spell, create a 1/2 green spider creature token with Reach. This is mostly for Phoenix. It's also just like decent against decks that play a lot of instant sorceries. The Stone Brain. It's an extraction effect for 2 mana to cast and 2 mana to activate and exile it. It's really good against combo decks. 2 Unlicensed Hearse. It's for our graveyard decks. I don't feel like I need to explain Unlicensed Hearse. We're playing a Cityscape Leveler and an Emrakul, the Promised End, for decks that we really need to go over the top of and can answer. And it's very likely the games are going to go very, very long. Pretty stock Jund sack deck. Now, it's mostly red-black sack. Splashing green for Ygra and sideboard Haywire Might. Sometimes the deck sideboards Abrupt Decay as well. But really, Ygra is just so powerful, you know, with the deck that we're okay with it. The mana base is pretty straightforward. We're just trying to make sure we have our colors all the time. In combo decks, a lot of combo decks don't really focus on doing weird things with the mana like the mid-range versions of these red-black decks do. However, we are playing a Castle Lochwain and a Dead of the Bugbear. Some versions are playing the Channel Lands. I think they're a little too cute. I'd rather have my colors so that our deck can just always function. Because the deck is weirdly color hungry. And so really what we're trying to do with this deck is get Mayhem Devil on the battlefield and sacrifice a bunch of things, either Cauldron Familiar and the food tokens with Witch's Oven, or the Scavenger's Talents, or Deadly Disputes, and deal a bunch of damage and nickel and dime our opponent, or Infinite Combo with Ygra. This deck also has a decent mid-range plan with Blood-Tithe Harvester and Fable the Mirror Breaker, so you know we like that as well. So let's talk about the combos in the deck first, and then we'll talk about the cards that are like supporting those combos. So Cauldron Familiar and Witch's Oven, by and large, is a very well-known combo. Witch's Oven, sacrifice Cauldron Familiar, it makes a food, sacrifice the food, bring back Cauldron Familiar. That is already good by itself, but if we pair that with Mayhem Devil, you deal an extra damage every time something is sacked. So every time you loop that, it makes your opponent lose 3 life and you gain 1 life. It's even better with multiple Cauldron Familiars or multiple Witch's Ovens. And you can get food in a bunch of other ways, like having Ygra on the battlefield. All the creatures are foods. Scavenger's Talents, first level, is if a creature would die, create a food token. This creature only triggers once each turn, that we can use those foods to bring back Cauldron Familiar. And there's an infinite combo with Ygra and Cauldron Familiar. Now, if we have Ygra and any one other creature on the battlefield, it could be another Cauldron Familiar, and have at least 2 Cauldron Familiars, 1 in the graveyard, 1 in the battlefield, or 2 in the graveyard, what we can do is sacrifice the creature other than Ygra, whether it be Cauldron Familiar or something else, to bring Cauldron Familiar back, because all the creatures are foods according to Ygra. They lose a life, you gain a life because of Cauldron Familiar's Enter the Battlefield ability. Then you take the other Cauldron Familiar in the graveyard, they lose a life, you gain a life. Then you just keep doing that over and over, sacrificing the Cauldron Familiar on the battlefield for the one in the graveyard. Now, this is even cooler because you can kind of move into it like quite a bit. Because yes, whenever one of your creatures die, create a food token. Cool, that's already like pretty good. It's level 2 is when you sacrifice a permanent, target player mills 2 cards. Like, okay, so like we sacrifice Cauldron Familiar with the Witch's Oven, sacrifice the food, sacrifice the blood token off Blood-Tithe Harvester or Deadly Dispute. We want to mill ourselves, because we want to get those 2 Cauldron Familiars in our graveyard. And even if we mill the Ygra, that's totally fine, because we can level it up to level 3, and at the beginning of our end step, sacrifice 3 other non-land permanents, bring back the Ygra, and then do that combo, because we'll have the Cauldron Familiars in our graveyard as well. So that's all the weird combo-y stuff. I think it's important to mention that, like, the Mayhem Devils and things like that trigger off of Deadly Dispute, which we have a lot of things in our deck and tokens that we make, whether it be food tokens or blood tokens or whatever, or Cauldron Familiars that we're totally okay with sacrificing with Deadly Dispute so we can churn through our deck and hit our combos. Bitter Triumph allows us to, remove things at a cost, but being a combo deck, we don't really care about costs like that. Claim the Firstborn is really cute. Gain control of target creature, mana value 3 or less till end of turn, tap that creature, gains haste, because it's a active treason where we get to jam, but it's 1 mana, and then we can sack that creature to Witch's Oven or Deadly Dispute, so we don't have to sack our own things. So that's a little bit of a combo there as well. And then our sort of mid-range plan, we're playing Fatal Push just for removal, really cheap. This card's great. Blood-Tithe Harvester allows us to apply some pressure, allows us to be a removal spell on a stick, and also creates a blood token just as another thing to sacrifice to Mayhem Devil or to sacrifice to Deadly Dispute or things like that. Croxa is a little bit of a flex slot, but is very good, against these decks that go really, really long. And then Fable of Mirror Breaker is even better, with our mid-range plan. It digs us into our combo. We're playing a lot of cards that kind of don't do anything by themselves, so it allows us to discard those cards if we don't need them. It ramps us. Being able to flip into Reflection of Kiki Jiki and copy a Mayhem Devil and then sacrifice things is really disgusting. There's a lot of really cool things with this deck. As you can see, there's a lot of incredible interactions. This deck's very hard to play, so you're going to want to get some games in with it before you play any sort of relevant tournament. As far as the sideboard goes, Duress, for these combo decks and control decks, similarly for Thoughtseize, Path of Peril for the go wide, really small creature decks, Leyline of the Void for graveyard decks. Ob Nixilis is really good against the incredibly slower decks, just to diversify our threats, because it's a lot harder for us to get off our combos and to even have our mid-range plan, because we're kind of a bad mid-range deck because we're a mid-range deck leaning towards combos or a combo deck leaning towards mid-range decks. Gigantha because it's free, but please make sure you are not revealing Gigantha if you bring in Path of Peril or Leyline of the Void, because that's how you lose games of Magic. And then Haywire Might, since we're playing green anyway, allows us to have these answers against things like Grafdigger's Cage or Leyline of the Void or whatever. So this is mono black mid-range. Now the overall strategy of this deck is that it's attacking on two different axes. Number one is that it's a pretty solid mid-range deck. It's running Hand Destruction and Duress and Thoughtseize, Fatal Push, Shieldred's Edict, Go for the Throat. And so it's looking to do the same thing as Mono Black in that it's 1-for-1 in the opponent out of the hand and on the board. Just instead of Fable the Mirror Breaker, we have Unholy Annex, where you draw a card at the end step of your turn, and you lose 2 life unless you control a demon. And you can pay 5 mana for Ritual Chamber to unlock that room to get a 6/6 black demon, so it kind of combos with itself. And we're running another demon as well. And so it has that really sweet mid-range plan, but it also has sort of a Splinter Twin thing going on in that it can just win. Between Unstoppable Slasher and Bloodletter of Aklazotz is probably how you pronounce it. Unstoppable Slasher is a 3-mana 2/3 death touch. And when it deals damage to a player, they lose half their life rounded up. So if my opponent's at 20, I jam, deal 2 damage to them, they go to 18, trigger Unstoppable Slasher, they go to 9. When Unstoppable Slasher dies, if it had no counters on it, return to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control with 2 stun counters on it. So it's really hard to answer as well without exile removal. Now, this combos with Bloodletter of Akalotz, which is a 2/4 flying for 4 mana. If an opponent would lose life during their turn, they lose twice as much life instead. Twice of half is whole, so if you have a Bloodletter and you connect with Unstoppable Slasher, you just win. And you can do this reasonably easily because you can get things out of the way with the removal spells and make sure they don't have removal spells with their Hand Destruction or have blockers with the Hand Destruction, just win. So you can play this mid-range game with the rest of your deck while making them fear this just win combo that the mid-range game is actually really good at doing. As far as other cards in the deck, Castle Lothwain lets us continue drawing cards. Field of Ruin deals with problematic man lands and stuff that would block Unstoppable Slasher. Hive of the Eye Tyrant is great graveyard hate, and again, alternate win condition since we're kind of a control deck as well. Same thing with Mutavault. A whole bunch of swamps, a Takamuma just because it's free, we can get things back from the graveyard, and an Urborg to kind of make up for these colorless lands. Now we're running a playset of both Hand Destructions. The main deck for Duress is, again, mostly to get rid of removal spells out of our opponent's hand and just try to make it so we can combo much easier. And for Thoughtseize, and also Duress is just very good right now as well. For Fatal Push, obviously, it's just the best removal spell in the format, along with Go for the Throat and Shieldred's Edict. Shieldred's Edict noticeably being able to answer Planeswalkers really cleanly. 2 Reckoner Bankbuster just to draw us more cards in addition to the Unholy Annex that we already talked about. Graveyard Trespasser as a great mid-range card and additional graveyard hate. And Invoke Despair, which is very, very good against the enchantment decks, but also just insane against control and mid-range, and just gets us really, really far ahead and advances the mid-range plan really dramatically. I can speak. It's fine. So the main deck is really straightforward as long as you understand that combo. As far as the sideboard goes, we have 2 cut down for these aggressive decks, just as mostly as Fatal Push 5 and 6. Costet Bronco is, again, it's kind of a Dark Confidant equivalent. We're siding this in against control and mid-range decks and really any deck that we can't rely on the combo against, especially decks that we don't really care about our life total. Go Blank, very good against Phoenix and control and whatnot. Shieldred is just very, very good against aggro. decent against control, and is just like an additional threat. Additional Evoke Despair, which we've already talked about. March of Wretched Sorrow is a really good additional removal. It noticeably gains life, and we can exile a bunch of black cards from our hand in order to cast it. So gaining a ton of life against like the aggressive red-black deck or whatever is very good. Miko Massacre is a great board wipe. Also just happens to, the trigger on the enchantment also just happens to be very good against sack. And Unlicensed Hearse is our dedicated graveyard hate. So this is Gruul aggro. It's actually really, really close to the standard version of the deck because there's so many good cards that were printed in standard. It's kind of like a mouse aggro deck, comboed with all these aggressive cards as well. So let's just go through the 1-drops. I'm just going to go in mana cost order. So we have Burst Lightning. Burst Lightning is a great shock, great removal. It also can be kicked later in the game for a little bit extra damage for that last push. Heartfire Hero is a 1-mana 1/1 mouse that is relevant. With Valiant, when it becomes the target of spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, put a +1/+1 counter on it. When it dies, it deals damage equal to its power to each opponent. So very good alongside pump spells or, things like that with the Valiant. Kimono Faces Kakazan is just an incredible aggressive card. It is a saga. On the front side, it says on the first chapter deals 1 damage to each opponent and each planeswalker they control. Its chapter 2 is the next creature spell you cast this turn enters with additional +1/+1 counter. And its third chapter is it flips into a 2/2 haster, where if the creature dealt damage this turn by a source you control would die, exile it instead. It does everything our deck wants. We're playing 4 Monastery Swiftspear, which is very good alongside non-creature spells, which is also good alongside these pump spells, what we already talked about is good with Heartfire Hero. We're playing 3 Reckless Rage. One, because we can target our own creatures like Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger to be able to get their triggers and kill something the opponent has. But also we can Reckless Rage alongside Swiftspear, and the prowess trigger will resolve before Reckless Rage resolves and it kills things. It's also really good alongside Screaming Nemesis to deal an additional 2 damage to the opponent and make sure they can't gain life. Reckless Rage just works in this deck really, really well. Playing a Thud as an additional cost to cast the spell, sacrifice a creature. It deals damage equal to sacrifice creature power to any target. So this is a way to fling. Essentially very good alongside pump spells like Monstrous Rage, which for some reason we skipped. Pump spells, but also especially super-duper good alongside Heartfire Hero because it essentially deals double its power to the opponent because you also get the Heartfire Hero trigger. Speaking of Monstrous Rage is our primary pump spell. Is a 1-mana target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. Create a monster roll, a token attached to it, which gives +1/+1 and trample. Also, because it's a spell that targets things, it triggers Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger, which we'll talk about in just a second. Gives trample so you can trample over stuff. Kind of protects because it buffs up their butt and triggers prowess and triggers valiant, all that stuff. Playing 2 Bushwhack, not to fix our mana, but just a 1-mana fight card because you target your own creature. So again, it triggers Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger. And we're playing 2 Snakeskin Veil to fight against other removal. 1 mana, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, gains hexproof till end of turn. We've mentioned Emberheart Challenger already a few times. It's a 2-mana 2/2 with haste and prowess. When it becomes the target of a spell or ability you control for the first time each turn, exile the top card of your library. Until end of turn, you may play that card. So it allows us to dig through our deck. It also has prowess in and of itself. It combos with all these cards we're already playing because of Valiant, because of Heartfire Hero. It's just very, very good. We're playing 3 Manifold Mouse. Is a 2-mana 1/2 with Offspring. And at the beginning of combat in your turn, target mouse you control gains your choice of Double Strike and Trample until end turn. 99% of the time you're going to select Double Strike. But notice Heartfire Hero and Emberheart Challenger are both mice. And Valiant is not heroic. Valiant doesn't care that it's an ability. So when Manifold Mouse gives Heartfire Hero or Emberheart Challenger the Double Strike, then it either gets a +1/+1 counter for Heartfire Hero, or you get to exile the top card with Emberheart Challenger. Both extremely good, and you can do it every single turn. We're playing 2 Innkeeper's Talent because again it targets, so it triggers these things, pumps up our guys, makes them hard to answer, and puts even more +1/+1 counters, which is very, very good. Alongside Heartfire Hero, very, very good alongside Snakeskin Veil. We're playing 2 Questing Druid to be able to dig through our deck even more, but also it's just a really grindy card. And we're playing 3 Screaming Nemesis, which we've already talked about how it combos with some other cards in our deck, but also it's just so difficult to block and just needs a super clean answer. Being a 3/3 for 3 with haste, when is dealt damage, deals that much damage to any other target. If a player is dealt damage this way, they can't gain life for the rest of the game. So good. As far as our lands go, we have the basic red-green lands, some basic mountains, Soakin's on, things you should already know what they do. We're playing 2 Den of the Bugbear for our man lands. 4 mana, man's up to become a 3/2 red goblin creature. When it attacks, create a 1/1 red goblin that's attacked and attacking. And then we're playing a Ramanap Ruins. It's just another way to get the additional last few damage. We can pay 4 mana and sacrifice a desert and deals 2 damage to each opponent. This is the only desert, but so really it's pay 4 mana and we get to sacrifice itself to deal 2 damage to each opponent. So we are attacking, we are protecting our creatures, we're pumping up our creatures. That is essentially what's going on in the main deck, with a few cool combos with things like Reckless Rage and Manifold Mouse. As far as the sideboard goes, we're playing 2 Torch the Tower, partially as additional removal for the aggressive decks, but playing specifically Torch the Tower is important because it exiles, so other Heartfire heroes aren't triggered, it gets rid of Phoenix forever, stuff like that. Playing Magebane Lizard for combo decks and like Phoenix, because it's a 1/4 for 2. When a player casts a non-creature spell, it deals damage equal to that player equal to the number of non-creature spells they cast this turn, so it really punishes them for casting a lot of the same spell every turn. Playing 2 Pyroclasm for these aggressive decks, because Pyroclasm, frankly, isn't that good against us. Most of our creatures survive it. 2 Urbrass Forge for the slower decks. It's a 3 mana artifact. At the beginning of your combat in your turn, put an oil counter on Urbrass Forge. Then create an X1 red Phyrexian horror creature token with trample and haste, where X is the number of oil counters on Urbrass Forge. Sacrifice that token in the beginning of the next end step. We're playing 2 Hazoret of the Fervent for decks that are really good at answering what we're doing, and we end up with no cards in hand and are just totally burnt out, which is a 5/4 for 4 indestructible haste, can't attack unless you have 1 or fewer cards in hand, and you can discard a card. So like, once you get over 4 or 5 lands, you can discard the lands by paying 3 mana and dealing 2 damage to each opponent. We're playing 3 Pick Your Poison, decent 1 mana artifact and enchantment hate, really good against flyers, see like Archfiend of the Dross and stuff like that, or like Fable the Mirror Breaker, whatever. And then we're playing Grafdigger's Cage for our graveyard hate. If you like this video, please be sure to like and subscribe. Check me out on social medias. Links are above me and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.